It's about 9:30. Let's get into the BRBC real quick. Let me share my screen. I seem to have lost it. Hold on one sec. Okay. We're going to share in this one. Awesome. All right. If you have questions along the way, go ahead and ask them. Some of it's going to be review, but there is a new law that got passed, basically kind of updating the BRBC law or the buyer representation in California. So I don't know what other states are doing, but this is what California is doing. So if you have heard mixed, um, you know, feedback or whatever on what you should be doing because the California law didn't necessarily align with the NAR settlement agreement, it is now going to align with the NAR settlement agreement starting January 1st, 2026. So if you were hearing, oh, well, we need to just have them before we make the offer and things like that, yes, that is what the California law currently says, is that the buyer rep agreement or a compensation agreement needs to be in place prior to making an offer. However, the NAR settlement, if you are a realtor, basically supersedes that and says, no, you need to do it prior to showing a property. And that is what the law is being updated to as of January 1st, 2026. So regardless of if you're a realtor or not, if you're showing commercial, if you're showing land, it doesn't matter. It needs to be in place prior to showing the property starting January 1st, 2026. So this new regulation, this is updating AB 2992, which came about last year. January 26th is when that got implemented, or sorry, 2025. So the max, and they made a few updates as well because there was some, I guess, confusion on, well, is it 3 months? Is it 90 days? What is it as far as the maximum term length? It is, they've made a clarification, I guess, if you want to call it that. So maximum length of time for a buyer representation agreement will be 90 days rather than 3 months, unless the buyer is a corp, LLC, or partnership. So, not every month has 30 days in it. So you will want to make sure you are counting the days, because if you have 91 days in there, inadvertently, you have an invalid buyer rep agreement, and technically you would be in violation. To renew a buyer broker representation agreement, a renewal must be signed prior to the expiration of the original agreement, and the renewal can be no longer than 90 days. So you can't let your buyer rep agreement lapse and then 3 days later put in your Form MT and do an extension. You would need to do an entirely new BRBC or PSRA, whichever one you're using there. There's a rebuttal presumption that it is practicable for a buyer's agent to obtain a signed buyer representation agreement before the agent shows the buyer a property. This modifies AB 2992, which only requires a buyer broker contract to be in place prior to agent writing this offer. So this is where we're at currently. This brings California law into alignment with the NAR settlement, which has always required agents representing buyers of a residential property to have a buyer representation contract in place before showing properties. So that is probably the biggest update of all. So it is now uniform with the NAR settlement. There's no more gray area. I talked to a lot of agents. A lot of agents looking to join the company, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, there's this gray area." No, there isn't anymore. There wasn't really a gray area before either. It just depended on what type of property you were showing. But now it's uniform across the board. So in other words, a new regulation requires buyer broker contracts to be in place prior to a showing for agents representing buyers of any type of property, including buyers of non-residential properties. This is your commercial, this is your land. Um, and then sellers, agents acting solely on behalf of the seller may still show properties to buyers without having a buyer representation agreement signed by that buyer. So if you're a listing agent and a buyer calls you and they don't have an agent, you do not have to get a buyer rep agreement in place at time of showing, because at that point you're still working on behalf of the seller to allow this showing. Now, if they start engaging you to represent them, that is when you immediately need to put your buyer rep agreement in place with them. So this law applies to nearly all types of property, but excludes leases and rental agreements. You'll notice I underlined buyers up here. Um, so this law applies to real property improved with 1 to 4 dwelling units, including unit in a stock cooperative, condominium, or planned unit development, multi-unit residential property with more than 4 dwelling units, commercial real estate property, vacant land, a ground lease coupled with improvements, manufactured home or mobile homes. Those apply as well, whether they're in a park or not. So um, now for a little bit of review, licensing law violations. So any person licensed under the real estate law who violates the provision related to buyer representation agreements is deemed to have violated the licensing law. So this is very important that we get these in place prior to showing. You can see I just took a snippet here um, on the government site talking about buyer representation agreements. And in E here, if you are violating this law, is violating that person's licensing law. So basically, it puts your license at jeopardy if you get reported. So I cannot stress enough how important it is to strictly follow AB 2992, especially with this new revision, because the quote-unquote gray area that we had before is no longer put it in place prior to showing, no matter what the property type is, if you're working with a buyer. Um, this is still a red hot topic for DRE and DRE audits. When a DRE investigator chooses an agent to be audited, they ask for all transactions within the past 3 years, but tend to focus more on recent ones. They ask for buyer-tenant compensation agreements plus any modifications of terms, full purchase and lease agreements, full listing agreements, any and everything else that they choose to ask for. But those first three right there are definitely 100% going to be on their list of what they want me to provide them from the properties that they are inquiring on. So if you do not have a properly executed agreement, you may, or in parentheses will, be subject to discipline, including and not limited to fines, license suspensions, and license revocations, depending on how serious it is. Instant MLS fines will also be assessed without warning, so should you be turned in or caught without representation agreements, both listing and buyer representation. So I took a couple snippets from CRMLS, a little fine section there where you can see, all the violations they have and the fine assessed. So 9.1 with CRMLS is showing listed property without written compensation agreement or insufficient compensation agreement with buyer, meaning maybe you have one, but maybe you had it longer than 90 days, or you didn't have the property designated and things like that. It's an instant $2,500 fine with them. So don't get caught, showing property without a buyer rep agreement in place. There are agents out there that love to turn in other agents, and this will be, at minimum with MLS, a $2,500 fine. You can see all these are instant fines here. Failure to obtain a seller's authorization to list an MLS. I wanted to throw this in there because DRE auditors also are monitoring social media and they're monitoring Zillow and they're looking for agents. There's a little tangent right here. They're looking for agents advertising properties for rent without a lease listing agreement in place. So if you have a property that you are marketing for rent, you're doing tenant placement services, or otherwise known as leasing, for one of your clients. Maybe you just sold the home, they're an investor, and they said, hey, can you get this rented for me? And you're like, great, I'll do it because you work with me. You have to have a lease listing agreement in place, even if it's not an MLS. If you're posting that on behalf of the seller, meaning you're marketing that property, you have to have the lease listing agreement in place. Otherwise, you will be in violation. So be sure to get those. All right, back to the BRBCs. And again, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat as we go. But I'm just doing a little refresher here since we're on the topic. So how should a buyer or broker ensure they are compensated for their work on behalf of the buyer? So to comply with NAR settlement and CA law, a buyer broker must enter into a written agreement with the buyer before buyer tours any home with the broker or affiliated agent. That agreement must conspicuously disclose the specific amount or rate of compensation the broker will receive or how the amount will be determined. The buyer's broker cannot receive compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount or rate in the agreement with the buyer. Before signing an agreement with a buyer, the broker or agent should discuss the broker's services, value and compensation, and ensure the buyer understands they will be responsible to pay their broker. So we don't want to say, oh, well, definitely the seller's going to pay. I'm working for free. If you're still using that language, you stop, because that will get you in trouble for sure. A buyer may pay their broker's compensation from any source. This could come from the buyer's liquid funds, or the buyer could find a third party to pay their broker. For example, the buyer could seek to use programs that assist buyers with closing costs or seek concessions from the seller through the purchase agreement. Concessions or other assistance can be used for closing costs, including payments to the buyer's broker. Buyers can ask their broker to seek payment from the seller directly. Nothing's changed there. 3 terms must be met in your compensation agreement in order to have a right to receive compensation. The BRBC and the PSRA cover these. You don't have to do anything aside from fill it out correctly. So if you're using some other form out there, I highly advise do not do that. Use the forms that are provided by CAR, which is your buyer rep agreement and your property showing agreement. Both of those comply with these 3. So 1 is you have to have a valid agreement. 2, it needs to cover the property. And 3, requested compensation amount paid by seller is in the offer not higher than the amount on the buyer compensation agreement. I think we had a couple of things in chat come in. We did. So what if I hold open other agents listing? Since I don't have an agreement with the seller, do I have to have a visitor's form, the open house, sign anything? So DRE they are beginning to crack down on holding open houses for other brokers or agents outside this brokerage. You'll notice that maybe other brokers are not allowing it anymore. They are asking for you to have an agreement in place with that listing brokerage. So you might want to have that in place, some sort of written agreement in place, stating that basically, they're allowing you to work on behalf of the seller as well. Hopefully that kind of covers that. So I'm sure we're going to see that topic come into play more this year. I am starting to see that a lot more kind of pop up. Next question, can we still share our commission with the buyer's broker? Are you talking about as a listing agent? I would advise not sharing your commission. I would try and keep that separate. But can the listing brokerage pay out of their fee? It doesn't say that you can't, but I would advise not even offering that. So that will probably be scrutinized. With regard to rental properties as an agent, would I need an authorization from the listing agent owner to market the property to potential rental tenants? Yes, should always have something in writing when you are advertising somebody else's property. So we're looking at the BRBC right here. So number 1, valid agreement. So this is your valid agreement right here. Section A, representation period. How long is it good for? Do not exceed 90 days. Number 2 is, does it cover the property? If you are showing a single family residential, um, which includes condominiums and manufactured homes, it's defaulted to that, so you don't need to check any boxes, but you do need to put in locations. I recommend a county, as it keeps it kind of general. Sometimes, buyers may skip around cities. They might say, hey, I want to start here, and end up looking over in this other city because they're priced out or they like it better or whatever. So you can do counties. Um, that's usually what I recommend. But, if for some reason you have a very savvy buyer and they're like, look, I'm only going to use you if we buy a home in this particular city, then you need to put that city in there versus the county. And then compensation, this is number 3. Put your compensation amount in here. I recommend starting high and then negotiating it with the offer. This is what I see most happening right now since the NAR settlement is I see buyers agents coming in kind of hot and then getting negotiated out with counter offers and then settling on a final amount. So if any of these terms are not met, the broker or agent will be in violation of AB 2992 and may not receive compensation. The agent will still have full fiduciary duties to the buyer, although breached by negligence of their agent, and the agent will still be obligated to perform as their agent under agency laws. So, in other words, you will be working for free while also risking DRE and MLS discipline. So, things you cannot do. No, you cannot ask the buyer to pay us outside of escrow. We do not have a valid agreement nor a right to receive compensation because you don't have that agreement in place or you don't have a valid agreement. No, you cannot ask the buyer to pay you directly after closing. Business and Professions Code 101.7 no real estate salesperson shall accept compensation for activity requiring a real estate license from a person other than the broker under whom he or she is licensed at the time. No, you cannot backdate the compensation agreement. So I have actually been asked that. And what that is, it's fraudulent intent, it's misrepresentation, potential for harm, unenforceability, all of which can lead to discipline from the DRE. So backdating actually any document falls under that. So don't ever backdate documents, just have it in place properly at the time. And lastly, we cannot bend the rules for you to receive commission illegally. So if you don't have these things done properly, we can't jeopardize our license at the brokerage to pay you the commission because you didn't do the paperwork properly. So please just follow the rules. Everybody's doing the same thing. So buyers really can't say, well, this person over here is not doing it. If they're not doing it, then they're in violation, and maybe you want to bring that up to them. If a consumer wants to start looking for properties in areas not covered by the original terms of your compensation agreement, use Form MT buyer representation to modify the territory. It's really that simple. So we're looking at for a snippet of Form MT buyer rep. And, previously I said we're going to be looking in the counties of San Diego, and now my buyer says, well, let's look in Temecula. So now I need to add Riverside. If a consumer wants to renegotiate their compensation obligation from the original terms of your compensation agreement, use the same one, Form MT buyer rep, to modify the compensation amount. You will just put it right here. It says they have a line right for it. We have another snippet here. It says amount of compensation is changed as follows, 2.5. Can you make that for only that property? Yes, you can. So you're negotiating that property with your buyer, and the seller counters back and says, hey, we're not going to pay that amount, but we'll pay this amount instead. You can change your rep agreement down by checking this box, putting the amount there, checking this box, and say this modification applies to only the following property or properties. So you can make it for only that property, and maybe negotiations fall out, and you start looking for other properties and offering again. Your original buyer rep agreement is still in effect. Let me check the chat real quick. If my BRBC with my client is 2.5, then the agreed upon compensation in the RPA between the seller and buyer's agent is only 2. Are we still allowed to reduce the compensation that our buyer agreed to pay on our BRBC? If so, how do we go about that? So this is where we use this form MT to modify it down for that property only. Yep. All right. So sounds good, Manny. So a couple real life scenarios we can run through real quick. Scenario 1, if you have a valid buyer representation agreement in place, you make an offer on a property and ask the seller to pay the buyer's obligation of the buyer's agent compensation 2.5%. The seller sends a counteroffer with one of the terms being that they will only pay 2 towards the buyer's obligation. The buyer cannot afford to pay the difference in cash, which would be 0.5%, and ask the buyer's agent to renegotiate their commission to match what the seller is agreeing to pay. What are you going to do in that scenario? This is the one we just went through. So in this scenario, you create Form MT, buyer representation, and you modify the compensation as changed down to 2%. I'm going to check that box and say it only applies to this property here. This will allow you to be in compliance with NAR and AB 2992 for the property being negotiated, but leave the original compensation terms of 2.5 in effect should your negotiations with the seller fail and you need to move on to a new property. Scenario 2, you have a valid buyer representation agreement in place. You make an offer on a property and ask the seller to pay the buyer's obligation of buyer agent compensation 2.5%. The seller sends a counteroffer with one of the terms being that they will not pay any amount, 0, toward the buyer's obligation to the buyer's agent. The buyer can afford to pay the buyer's agent's compensation as willing to. What would you do in this scenario? Anybody want to throw that in chat? So you're going to do nothing. You have a valid compensation agreement in place. You can receive your full compensation amount as buyer paid compensation through escrow. You're going to provide your BRBC or PSRA to escrow prior to closing. They're just going to ask to see it. They're going to confirm that you have a valid agreement in place and you're able to receive this commission paid by buyer. If you have a mix where, and this does come up, where the seller is paying a portion and the buyer is paying a portion, they're probably still going to ask to see your compensation agreement. And then you'll see on the commission instructions that they send over, seller paid and then buyer paid. It'll have both amounts on there broken down. So, and then we'll do the same on the CDA should you be getting one. So, scenario 3, you are an escrow on a property with a husband and wife. You ask the seller to pay the buyer's compensation obligation of 2.5%, and they agreed at time of offer. You have also agreed to provide a small commission rebate to the buyer at closing from your commission. This is what your BRBC looks like. So beginning on 4/1, ending on 10/1, we made it exclusive. We put in the county that they're going to be looking in. We put in a compensation amount of 2.5. We have a continued right to payment in here at 30 days. We put in other terms. Buyer's agent to give $5,000 to buyers from commission at closing. I recommend wording that a little differently, but we're just using this. What would happen next in this scenario? Your buyer compensation agreement is void, actually. Let's see if we may get that one right. This actually happened to me on a $2 million property. My buyer paid me. Yeah. So in this scenario here, your buyer compensation is void and your ability to earn commission on the sale is in jeopardy. You're also subject to discipline by DRE and MLS, which can include fines as well as license suspension and revocation. Why? Because your agreement was more than 90 days, or currently more than 3 months. So we're talking a day or two either way here. So in that scenario, that extended well past. So that was a void agreement. Um, Additionally, you've breached your fiduciary duty with your buyers through negligence, as you do not have a right to compensation, and now you cannot fulfill your promise of a rebate at closing. You have not exercised reasonable care and skill with contract knowledge. While the contract is void, you did make a promise to rebate them $5,000 from your commission, which also exposes you to a claim from the buyer. Now that whole agreement is void, but you made the promise to them, and they're expecting that. So fiduciary duty as a license, we're going to wrap up with this just as a quick reminder. Duty of care. Agents must exercise reasonable care and skill in their professional conduct. Duty of loyalty. Agents must act solely in the client's best interest and not put their own or other parties' interests ahead of their clients. This means, been a slow year, you need the commission really bad. You do not want to put your need for commission above your client's best interest at any time. And that's when I see agents get in trouble the most, is when they are thinking about the commission more than the client's interest. Client's interest always come first. Duty of disclosure. Agents must disclose all material facts known to them that materially affect the value or desirability of the property, even if those facts are not known to the client. Duty of confidentiality. Agents must keep confidential information shared by the client, with some exceptions if required by law. Duty of obedience. Agents must follow the client's lawful instructions. Duty of accounting. Agents must account for all money and property received on behalf of the client. Duty of honesty and fair dealing. This would also apply to that others to the scenario 3. Agents must act honestly and fairly with all parties in the transaction. Duty to act with integrity. Agents must be truthful and avoid any deceptive practices. So yes, in the third scenario there, duty of care is where you definitely would have broken your fiduciary duty there because you did not take care to put a proper contract in place with your client. So um, that's all I have for today. Hopefully it was a good refresher for you. And I just noticed that my camera was not on the whole time. I'm sorry about that. So any other questions, give me a call. I'm always around. I'm working this week. Thursday, I'll probably take most of the day off. But I'm going to be around all weekend, Friday, obviously. Hope everybody has a great Thanksgiving. Hopefully you're hanging out with some family and having a good time. So we are not going to have a meeting next Monday. We're going to have a bye week. We will be sending out the RSVP for the Christmas parties. Again, those are in Anaheim, December 10th, which is a Wednesday, from 6 to 8 p.m. And in Forest Ranch on Thursday, December 11th, again from 6 to 8 p.m. Both locations are the Carl Strauss locations. If you came last year, we had a great time. It's kind of a mix and mingle. It's nothing super formal, but we have some good food. Everybody gets to kind of meet each other, and it's generally a good time. Everybody has a good time. So hope you can make it. Um, and yeah, looks like I think I got everything in the chat. And that is correct, Manny. If you're answering someone else's, you have to have that MT in place prior. So hopefully, everybody, again, have a great week and give me a call if you need anything. We'll talk to you soon.